late, and it is all our fault. We were not expecting that the lunch would get prolonged. Otherwise, our honorable guest, she was ready to be here and talk. Before I formally request Shafkat Kaka to formally introduce our guest speaker today, let me give a collective introduction of all of you. So, ma'am, this is, of course, invited guests. They represent civil society organizations. They represent corporate sector, private sector. In Pakistan, one of the things that has actually, I should mention that public, private, and non-governmental sectors, they're working in collaboration with each other when it comes to climate change and when it comes to environmental issues. We have among us Ma'am Aisha Khan, who heads this Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change, a network of civil society organizations working on climate change issue. We have among us Dr. Ihtisham Anwar, who is the Provincial Secretary of Education, and in Punjab, the largest province, and they have recently started teaching environment and climate change in the school and high school level. So they have actually incorporated the subject in the curriculum. We also have the representative of Core Alliance, an alliance of corporate and sector and multinationals against plastic pollution. Nestle, Unilever, Pepsi, Angro, Jazz, and many other, they are part of it. So they're represented by Mr. Waqar Ahmed. We also have representatives of Unilever and Pepsi here. And of course, the youngsters from different universities. So we wanted it to be a very representative, mindful of the fact that you only have a day here in Islamabad. So we wanted to get them here so that you can have a candid discussion with them. And this talk is being live streamed as well. So we'll also be getting comments and questions through our Zoom link, Zoom page. The format is that we'll request Ingrid to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be opening the session for interaction and conversation. I'll request you to remain brief when you give your comments or ask questions so that maximum of you can avail the opportunity of sharing your ideas. And now I request Shafkat Kaka to formally introduce Ms. Singer Anderson to the participants.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ahmed. And I'd also like to thank all of you for responding to our invitation at a very, very short notice. And I think your presence here signifies your appreciation both for UNEP and Mrs. Anderson, as well as SDPI. We have our distinguished Chief Guest, Inga Anderson, Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. She is a trained economist and environmentalist by training and by inclination. She has almost 3.5 decades of distinguished services and work in the area of sustainable development and environment protection. She had a number of important assignments in the World Bank between 2011 and 2015. between 2011 and 2015, she was actually vice president of MENA, of Middle East and North Africa region. But before that, she was head of the division for sustainable development. She moved from key divisions within the World Bank, which gave her a tremendous exposure to the interplay of environment and social protection and economic development. She started her first term in UNEP 4 years ago, and I'm delighted to inform you all that she has recently been elected by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Secretary General to another 4-year term. And during her 4 years, UNEP has made tremendous strides. UNEP has grown in size and in terms of its footprint or impact on the global environment and in various areas. I was telling her that the number of divisions in UNEP, which is one measure of the spectrum of activities that UNEP handles, has doubled. And from the time I was there, we had a much smaller global organization. And UNEP has been one of the most significant organizations in the area of environment and sustainable development from the time the past 50 years since its inception after the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. And there is never a dull moment in UNEP, and there is never a dull moment for the executive director. He or she moves with speed and with tremendous contribution. What Mrs. Anderson is heavily engaged now is, in addition to the sustainable development goals, in addition to the climate change agenda, where UNEP's involvement is becoming heavier and heavier, UNEP has spearheaded one of the most remarkable initiatives for preventing and the further spread and for rolling back, if possible, this one of the major challenges of the Industrial Revolution for mankind, which is the pollution of plastics. And under her inspiration, the World Environment Assembly last March adopted a decision calling for the establishment of a process, an intergovernmental negotiation committee for an international legally binding instrument on pollution, plastic pollution, including the pollution of marine environment. I'm sure all of you have at some point read about the horrendous amounts of plastic. That the problem with plastic is it's indestructible. So out of the 9 billion tons of plastic that has been produced since 1950, 7 billion is still there somewhere, either in landfills or in dumps or making life miserable for aquatic life in the oceans. And it is, I think, all of us owe gratitude to UNEP for taking the initiative. Mrs. Anderson has moved with tremendous speed to ensure that the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Committee negotiation committee has already taken place in Uruguay. And according to the guidance provided by the UN Environment Assembly, they have a very difficult deadline, 2004. By the end of 2004, UNEP, the intergovernmental process, has to deliver an agreement which has something like 15, 20 key objectives relating to the pollution of plastic. And what we can say, Pakistan also has a serious problem, both micro and macro plastics. And some of our cities we've tried to control, but it is, as I say, one of the evils, one of the industrial revolution that we have to deal with. So once again, Anderson, a very, very warm welcome to the civil society of Pakistan, and we look forward to listening to your advice, to your briefings on what you are doing in general and in particular on this extremely crucial, extremely important issue of pollution, which is making enormous difficulties for humankind in its struggle for sustainable development.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. And it's obviously a great honor for me to speak today, and not least in SDPI, think tank that is recognized across the world for doing really bleeding edge stuff. And so to you, Mr. Cahill, you have a past in UNEP, and I think your heart is in environmental matters. We still live in the legacy that you left behind in our wonderful organization. And to you, Mr. Suleri, thank you very much. And to all assembled company, it's a great honor to be here today. Yes, indeed. We have produced $9 billion of this stuff, this amazing material that allows us to move things in a much lighter way, that allows us to keep safe, that allows us to enable food safety, that allows us to transport things from point A to point B. This amazing material is something that is unique, and it has enabled trade, commerce, jobs, opportunities. So the first thing is to say we're not anti-plastic, we're anti-plastic in the environment. That's important to understand. We are anti also finding that this stuff, it is, after all, an exhaustible material. We know oil is not infinite, and it's made from hydrocarbon. And we would, of course, like to see that this exhaustible material is just not used for the 5 minutes we carried 5 tomatoes home, but that it has a longer longevity in the economy. Once we take this stuff out of the belly of the earth and into the economy, it becomes critical that it stays in the economy and that we do not just discard it as waste back into the environment. We have produced, as we rightly heard, 9 billion tons of this stuff since it was invented. Every year we produce about 400 million tons of it, 300 million of which is right in the waste paper basket, the global waste basket. So that means that we are being very careless with this material. In fact, on an annual basis, we produce more waste than we do of the entire weight of all commercial airliners ever produced. Just try to make that one go through your head. So the point here is, of all of this waste, 11 million tons would go straight into the oceans, but a lot ends up in alleys, in rivers, therefore heading to the oceans, in drainage canals, in the environment, and always amongst the urban poor, where often waste management is a challenge. Now, Pakistan is no stranger to this phenomenon. Frankly, most countries are no strangers to this phenomenon. 3.9 million tons of plastic waste in 2020, the latest place number of our figures. And according to the Pakistan Ministry of Climate Change, of that 3.9, let's say 4 million tons, over 65% is quote unquote mismanaged. which means it's not sort of ending up in a certified landfill. And Pakistan is the second largest domestic market for plastic, obviously. That's a province of the size of the economy. So, we know that very, very limited recycling is taking place. Some numbers have that 18% municipal solid waste is recycled. Probably that's a high number, but let's not even talk about that. Only 3% of plastic that is used today in manufacturing in your beautiful country is recycled material. So 97 is not. And the irony is at a global level, global raw polymer, these little pellets, everyone saw the news of what happens when a container ship full of plastic pellets has an accident and they spill on the beaches of Sri Lanka. The pictures were horrific. These little pellets, which are the raw materials from which everything is made, adding various chemicals to make it hard, flexible, or what have you. These little pellets are cheaper from raw and virgin materials than are pellets from recycled. How can that make logical sense? It obviously doesn't. And so when the world came together in earlier this year and said, actually, this is a problem, we, the global nations of 193, we want to come together to find a pathway by which we can agree as 193 to end plastic pollution. When that decision was taken, I was instructed, you better finish this by member states as part of the resolution, that we have to finish this by the end of 2024. And so we have limited time to have these negotiations. I will say, and this is important since I'm speaking in Pakistan, that we saw very strong support from Pakistan at all political levels from previous governments and present, that this is an issue that Pakistan is leaning in on. And I should mention that the Pakistani representative High Commissioner to UNEP has been very engaged. She has been very engaged in this, as has the Ministry of Climate Change and many, many civil society groups. And Pakistan's engagement has been critical in helping set up this process on which we are in. And we saw already that in Islamabad, there was a ban in 2019 on the manufacture and purchase and storage of polythene bags, with some success, but not full follow through, I think we have to say. But every journey begins with a step, and we were really happy to see that step being taken. There's also the February 2022 action plan on national plastic partnership, which has really provided a pathway forward. So when we then think about the plastic chain, the chain that plastic takes through the production, from the little pellets that are produced largely by the same producers who are the oil producers, right? It's produced from hydrocarbon. Then it goes into what we call the converters, who make it into the stuff that we need. And thereafter, it will go into the brand owners, the Pepsi-Colas, the Coca-Colas, the Procter & Gamble's, the Unilevers, whoever brand owners is. They will have the specifications for what it is they need. And I often say to activists who say we are anti-plastic, I say, walk into your bathroom, go into your kitchen cabinet, and just reflect on what you see. There is a reality that we are all using this material because of its wonderful properties, but we are therefore also all have a responsibility to be part of the solution. That's the brand owners that I mentioned. Then after that, you will have the shipping, before, big shipping. Think containers of apples that are moving from one side of the world to the other. You want your apples to arrive fresh and without. So how are we packaging this? Often with plastic, often single use. Think of the headroom space in each container. It is often filled with what? Filled with plastics to provide for the bumper guarantee that the products arrive in good state. And think of everything else that we have to enclose and capture, contain as we move it around the world. And then, of course, the waste management side. part what goes as garbage and part what goes as recycling. So if we think about the entire production chain as I painted it for you, this treaty will have to deal with each of these instances and how to go about it. We all know that the way in which we can create value of something is to create scarcity of the other thing, the thing that is there. So that's sort of your, how are you dealing with new raw polymer versus recycled polymer? Well, one way would be to put a lid on new raw polymer. The world will probably not agree to this. Many environmentalists will think that that's a great idea, but one will have to see what is the global consensus in this space. So another way is that you can have legislation around the content. How much recycled content should there be in this thing? You can make legislation about banning things that frankly are wasteful. Your single-use plastic bag, 5 minutes home from the supermarket, 500 years in the landfill. Probably not a smart way to deal with waste. You can also think about the liquidification of products. We become very lazy as a species. We want everything fast. We want our soap to be pumped. Don't want to have the bother to do twice like this on a bar of soap. Think of all the liquidification that we've done. We want what used to be soap powder to be liquid washing powder. Why? Well, then we have it in a plastic container and we think that that's better. So the liquidification is something that many companies are speaking about. Actually, let's rethink the chemistry of how we deliver the product. I understood there was a representation from Pepsi Cola here. So let me just mention Pepsi Cola, because Pepsi Cola has done something really unique. Not that Coca-Cola hasn't, because I understand Coca-Cola is also here. But Pepsi Cola has just bought SodaStream. And that is sort of thinking beyond the bottle and thinking about how the product can be delivered in a different way. Not that that means we're not going to have it in bottles, because we probably will, but it's just looking at the product with a different on-ramp. And what we want to encourage through this negotiation is indeed this, yes, reduce, yes, reuse, yes, recycle, and yes, refuse. But all of the above are part and parcel of the journey. As part of this, I have engaged, and actually the CEOs of both these companies, whose name I've taken in vain, were present in a number of meetings that I've had at the highest level, because we are seeing some of the forward-leaning companies who don't want their brand to be diluted or brand value to be lost because of their product being in the environment, who want to be perceived as the solution finders, are actually stepping into this space bravely, even though their product is very much associated with plastic in the manner that which it is delivered. So civil society has a huge role to play here. Huge role on advocacy, huge role on the science side, huge role of generating data, huge role of awareness building. And this is where I think whenever I speak to civil society, there's some home truths. Just before I arrived here, I made a visit I was in Kenya, which is where we are based. I made a visit to Africa's largest landfill. I walked on 40 meters of garbage. It's an open landfill dump. I saw little boys and girls collecting plastic in the middle of the most apocalyptic landscape of catastrophe. As far as the eye can see, with garbage, a stench that is unbelievable. The ground, like you're walking on a giant mattress, and you are, because you're walking on 40 meters of stinking garbage. And so understanding that waste pickers, that group of people who live and do these jobs, that they are performing this job in completely unacceptable conditions, but this is often how their families survive. So as we think about modernizing the sectors, the words of the SDGs ring true: leave no one behind. These families have to be brought along and have to find a way to decent work and reliable income. And the children go to school, obviously. So making sure that we think about that in the treaty is also something that we're very clear on. So what might it look like at the end of the day? What we hear from the private sector is extended producer guarantees is something that they would like to see somehow reflected at the global level. Think about it like this: I have produced this thing. Somehow within that, there is a guarantee that it will have to come back. It will have to come back because legislation says so. It'll have to come back because systems are there to bring it back. It'll have to come back because of the recycling that is there, is actually physically there. But what then does that mean for the very smallest country, the country that sits in the middle of the Pacific and could not possibly have all the sophistication? It means that it'll have to go physically back in a container to some place in a bigger industrial space where indeed it could be recycled. So what kind of recycling are we talking about? Are we talking about mechanical, which has a lot lower footprint, or chemical? Well, this is where chemistry comes in. You can probably recycle a product mechanically up to 7 times, melt it down, reproduce it, etc., say some chemists and chemical specialists. But after that, you really need to work the molecules in a manner with a chemical recycling, which has huge carbon footprint. So that's a conversation that we need to also have. And what then about the chemicals that are in the plastic to give it certain properties, the flexibility, the hardness, the durability, the resistance to sun or rain or frost or whatever it is that we put in it? Well, clearly, we can't sort of sort every piece in every bucket. That will become an impossibility. So we will need to find some ways to clear the chemicals that are there and exit some chemicals, including PFAS. This is this forever chemical, persistent organic pollutant, finding ways that the material complexity that PFAS, the material sophistication that some of these chemicals bring can be otherwise brought. And then, of course, there is a final issue, which is that we think about plastic as being the only product. But you know, when my mother was a young woman, plastic didn't exist. In fact, she told me the story of sitting around the table as a young girl, a high school girl, just at the time of Danish liberation. And there were these 2 Americans sitting next to her with these weird, colorful blocks. And this nosy schoolgirl is listening in to what the Americans are saying. And they are there as a trade delegation in this restaurant where she's sitting, and they're talking about this new product. And one of them says, and my mother told me, the future is plastic. He said. Anyway, so that was in 1945. So what might we not know about the materials of tomorrow? Might they not be made of agricultural refuse, of cotton stalks, peanut shells, coffee shells, etc., to be revealed? So basically, we have begun the negotiations. We've had the first round of organizing the negotiation, kindly hosted by Senegal in Africa. The second round, the first negotiation, took place in Uruguay, and the third one is scheduled for May in France. The hope is very much that we will land on a deal that will have some legally binding elements and some non-legally binding elements. That we will land on a deal that takes care of leaving no one behind. That we will land on a deal that will deal with legacy plastics. This plastic that is already out in the environment, it will cost the Seychelles or Mauritius for decades to come money to clean up the beaches. Plastic that arrives on their beach that they have done nothing to produce, it arrives on their beaches. And so legacy plastic will have to be part and parcel of the conversation. And lands on a deal that will enable that there is a resource flow whilst everyone has a responsibility to manage their own waste, but nevertheless a resource flow that can deal with capacity building, enablement, as well as management of garbage. And finally, we land on a deal that declares the kind of chemicals that is in it and exits a number of plastics. Pakistan has the potential, this vibrant economy, to play a huge role. And I know, from what I know, Pakistan, its civil society, the leadership in this country, as well as its engagement on the global stage, that we will see Pakistan step into that, as you have already done, and lead us to a future that will be free of plastic pollution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Henson, and definitely our support is with you and with the UNEP for a plastic pollution-free future, and the future is plastic pollution-free. I can tell you the technologies which are being evolving. I'm sure as a few decades ago, when your mother was told that future is plastic. Now, with increased awareness and increased technology, future is the plastic pollution-free, but then we will have to collectively work for it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after this illustrious talk by Ms. Anderson, we will take some questions, some reflections, comments. As I said, please remain brief, and we can do this conversation for another 25 minutes or so. I know she had a next commitment at Ministry of Water. So at 3:25, we'll be concluding the session. So if you can raise your hands, those of you who would like to, and I can then. I'll take 3-4 interventions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, Imran. Imran from WWF.
Please, good afternoon. So again, ma'am, you talked about the two elements, legally binding elements and non-legally binding elements that are being proposed as part of the treaty. So I have two queries very briefly. One is what goes into the negotiations when we're deciding what will eventually become legally binding and what will become non-legally binding. And secondly, as far as the non-legally binding elements, what is in your mind the efficacy of such measures, given what we know about the non-legally binding elements in the climate treaty and our collective failure to follow up on that? Thank you.
The second one, yes. You can also introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Kazmi from PepsiCo. But just a couple of comments. So one, really impressed with the knowledge that you bring in on the subject and the fact that we can't really reject the existing economic models. We've got to disrupt them, through initiatives. I just wanted to bring three things to the table. Now, when we talk about from a developing country perspective, there are three things that need to move at the same pace with technology interventions. One, and commitment. One is regulations. Two, consumer. And the consumer bit is also linked with affordability, because a lot of these interventions, technology interventions, have a premium associated to it. In the West, where the consumer is educated and they have a pull and they're willing to pay premium because of that understanding, in developing countries, affordability, regulations, and consumers' perception becomes things that also need to be unlocked in addition to frameworks. So just wanted to hear your comments around that.
That's Mr.
Sajid Aslam. I'm looking after Asia Pacific as a public affair for ACCA. My question is more around from an implementation perspective, and definitely there has to be a lot of conversation before we get there. The funding side of it. I think the countries like Pakistan, like we talked about the premium where the countries are willing and can afford that one. But that impact equally, like if we are not implementing in Pakistan, ultimately it will impact Europe in a similar way, the way it impacted consumer here. So we have always seen one of a challenge, the funding side of it, how we are putting a funding for the project. But second part is the capacity building side of it, for people to understand how to access funding, how to really monitor that, and how to make sure that is going in a project and report it back as a progress on that side. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So I wear two hats. One is of Nestle, and another is for Core, which is an alliance Shweta mentioned about. So what I think the corporate sector is very much committed when it comes to sustainable plastics and moving towards packaging materials which are more sustainable. And that's why we're all designing our packaging into more recyclable. So they are designed for recycling. Now, when we're looking from the collective action point of view, the challenge that all the companies are, all the development sector is also facing is what to do with the infrastructure. Even our packaging is designed for recycling, but when it goes out, there's no infrastructure we can collect and recycle. So where we are ready to put up a cost as well, but of course our contribution to this plastic mess is smaller than the bigger mess out there. I think it's a very big question here how we prepare our governments and prepare the right kind of infrastructure and the right kind of policies.
The final question of this round, and then come again.
Hi, good afternoon, Ms. Anderson. An absolute pleasure to have you here at HCPI today. So you talked about how environmental governance is quite important for Pakistan and developing countries alike. But I think a very important aspect of that is also trading governance. And you touched upon it quite a lot. You mentioned the example of apples and how plastic is required to make sure that that consignment is fresh by the time it reaches whatever country it's supposed to. But and also you mentioned how Pakistan is a market for plastic, and about 4 million tons does it make its way here. So mid-2022, there was this news that circulated about how the global north tends to dump a majority of its waste here in Pakistan's landfills. But unfortunately, due to lack of regulation, a lot of toxic waste also gets imported into Pakistan through that plastic waste, which renders that waste quite useless for companies that would like to make use of that plastic. So, I mean, there's of course need for governance and regulation when it comes to plastic waste like this. And you mentioned the whole dignity part as well, how, over here as well, there are children who do make their ways to these landfills and how they're unaware that not only are they exposing themselves to all this waste, but it's also toxic, which is going to not just affect them, but then their generations as well. So just this is one aspect that I'd really like for UNEP to take lead on, being an organization where all 193 countries do have these sessions where everyone gets to have a say. So perhaps this is something for the developing world that the global north can sort of take lead in and help us out, because when you say that nobody should be left behind, it should not just be on an individual level, but of course at an international level. So yeah, let's see.
Thank you. And these are really brilliant comments. And obviously we don't have all the answers. That's why it's 193 countries sitting around a very large table trying to find a way forward that will leave no one behind. But let me try first on WWF, legally binding, non-legally binding. Let me give you an example, capacity building. You can't comply a country to do capacity building. It will not be a legally binding, just as an example, right? Non-legally binding, there will be an aspect regarding frequency of reporting. Some countries will want to have more frequent sort of monitoring and reporting, others will not. You can't force it, I would try to, but you may have some degree of flexibility in that space. Legally binding will have to be something about declaration, at least on chemicals. I think that has to be very clear. Legally binding at the national level, I think we're already seeing a good number of countries where you do have recycling. It is when the recycled content is legislated. The recycled content of your plastic bottle has to be X. And by country, by year 2025, it has to be Y. And by 2030, it has to be Z. I think those kind of steps. Now, some countries will have a faster time schedule than others, because of where the country is in its sophistication of recycling, the infrastructure. And that leads me to the question from PepsiCo, because regulations are absolutely critical. Yes, there is a degree of what North does unto us thing, but let's not get too far down that track. And I say that to the madam, because in fact, I live in Kenya. 12 years ago, they banned plastic bags, $4,000 if you have one as a fine. No, $1,000 if you have one, 4 years in jail. End of. We don't have plastic bags anymore in Kenya. It works, right? It was only single use. very harsh. But plastic bags are gone. Plastic bottles, not yet, right? But the point is a lot can be done by a regulatory setting. You can take countries in the global north that have got a sophisticated regulatory setting. You contrast that with other countries in the global north, equally wealthy, where for reasons that we can discuss, they don't. And in one country, you see plastic all along the roadway, a very large country, for example, that doesn't have anything. And then you drive in other countries and in equally wealthy countries, very good regulatory. So the regulation is absolutely critical. And I very much agree with PepsiCo here. Now, the affordability is a real issue, right? If you're very, very poor, you buy very small portions of something that comes packaged in something. You know, the breakthrough that we saw with washing powder, these little individual sachets in India, and I'm assuming also here in Indonesia, this is making affordability real. So we need to rethink packaging, especially the double layered. They are our biggest enemy, those ones that have a metallic layer on the inside or the cardboard with a polythene lining. Can't do anything with it. Just go straight into the plastic dump. And burning it, you will inhale all of these bad fumes, plus you will emit CO2. So being smart around affordability is absolutely critical, and consumer awareness. Because of the harshness, I think on the African continent of some 50 countries, 36 have bans, and they mean it when they say it. You have a high awareness simply because somebody in the broader family once got that fine, and you know the story is there to be told in the community. And so it kind of works in a way as a deterrent, but also as an awareness creator. Not that I only want the challenge of the stick, but you also want the carrot. And in some countries, you get a little punch card, and you get, the more you bring back, you get a punch, and therefore you get a discount next time you buy the thing. That's the incentive way of doing it. So I think, and we're seeing this also in developing countries. So I think it is about the centralized system. If my product that I buy from company X has certain recycling methodology and company Y, I won't do it. I'll just mix the whole thing into my garbage can. But if there is a place where I can go and I even get a punch in a card that would give me a discount for something or a goodie somehow, one way or the other from the big supermarket or from wherever I do my shopping, that becomes interesting. Then, on the question from the SCPI for Asia Pacific, on the funding side and finding funding streams, yes, but the regulatory settings will be a lot of the answers. The moment that it becomes a requirement to have recycled content, I promise you, at the national level, with enforcement, private sector will stream into the recycling business. It will happen. And that's the dimension. Yes, there will still be money needed for capacity building and for legacy plastic. That's a given. But the new plastic, the closing the plastic tap, I often compare it to, you've gone away on vacation, you left your bathroom tap open. What's the first thing you do when you come home? It's not to mop the floor, it is to close the tap. And closing the tap is finding ways of the regulatory side. Design for recycling from the gentleman from Nestle, absolutely correct. And the infrastructure therefore needs to be in place, absolutely correct. That's where the regulations will come in. It will not be public sector money from the global north coming in to do this. It'll be good business. That's why, I mean, Pakistan, you're a big plastic producer. You import raw polymers and you produce a lot of plastic, some of which gets exported to friends, in your neighboring and beyond. And so the moment these plastic producers who are innovators and job creators and growth makers, they have to produce it out of recycled content, they will do so. And they will find ways of getting their hands on it. When I speak to the CEOs from many plastic using companies, they say, we've set these ambitious targets for recycled content. We just can't get our hands on the stuff. because there's no regulation that will help us get the hands on the stuff. Now, I still push these same companies to rethink packaging, rethink sizing, rethink, does it really have to be liquidified? You know, can it be delivered in a dry form, in a carton box, or in some other form? I have seen, and now in US and Europe, you can buy washing powder for a whole wash. I should have brought them. I love them. I bought that one thing. It's no bigger than this. It's a little leaf put into the washing machine. It's compressed soap. You can have it in an envelope and you will have 50 washes, no more than this. So there are ways we need to rethink the products. And then trade, yes, from the lady here. You are so very right that trade is a dimension, which is why WTO, the World Trade Organization, led by Ngozi Konjo-Iweala, is very much engaged with this. In fact, is sending us one of their primary staff to work with us to ensure that we understand the trade dimension. Dumping is illegal. You cannot, if you are a party to the Basel Convention, dumping, i.e., you buy from a country, the containers go back empty, you stuff them with plastic or whatever, and it's dumped. It is illegal unless you have free, prior, and informed consent and you can be taken to international court. I don't think Pakistan receives a lot of dumping anymore. It is true that was a dimension in the past. China has now banned all import of plastic waste. China used to process it. So exporting is becoming more and more difficult, and dumping is decidedly illegal. But the health impacts of the plastic that is in the dumps already is significant, particularly when it burns or when it rots. And those impacts are very real and something that we have to take into account as we move forward.
Thank you. In the second round.
Thank you so much. This is Dr. Javed Sayed. I'm leading one of the research group who is working on the hazardous chemicals at Comsat University, Islamabad. So my research is basically oriented towards persistent organic pollutants, and I'm working on the e-waste driven pollution in Pakistan for the last 5 to 6 years. So sorry, I'm not agree with the transboundary movement of this hazardous waste, especially electronics waste. If we look at the illegal part of this side, so Pakistan is one of the topmost importer of this illegal waste, and after the ban imposed by the China, so we are going to be the next dumping yard in the world. So we have some statistics with us, because I have a project from Asia Pacific Network on Global Change Research. Yeah, it's related to the transboundary movement of the PVC, and the second project is on the electronic waste. So I think we should think about this, because e-waste is one of the major source of the hazardous chemicals, especially the flame retardant. As you mentioned that you guys are working on the PFAS, but before going to ban the PFAS and all these new chemicals, we need to think and we need to look about the legacy chemicals, especially in the developing country.
Correct.
So we are looking forward to work with UNEP and definitely with UNDP. You have already a few of the good projects with the Ministry of Climate Change. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. And in Pakistan, as you said, that somewhere bans have worked, but in Pakistan, unfortunately, it didn't work. So my question would also be regarding the same, because what we saw was that the ban did work before the pandemic, but then pandemic happened. So are you looking at the relationship between pandemic and the culture of this disposable culture?
Bilal?
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Bilal is head of National Disaster Risk Management Fund and the RMF.
Thank you very much. Thank you, madam. Well, I had a question, and the lady over there, with the very nice glasses, actually, she covered my so I'm actually downgrading my question, but I think her question is very, very valid, especially when any treaty, any international governance treaty, when we look into it, and then this whole kind of dichotomy between the developing countries and the developed countries come into it, and then what we've seen from a number of other treaties, either CBD or climate change, the whole gender component actually come into the picture, and I think that's going to need to be addressed. Since so I'm downgrading it to a comment now, not a question as such. Environmental, because I shouldn't prejudge what this treaty or what the governance is going to look like, and that from your talk very well enlightened and illuminated. I think there are competing interests here. So one is, of course, looking purely in economic terms. One, of course, is that there is a whole global economy of plastics, and then banning, and I think there is kind of consensus in the room that the banning in most of the cases will work. But I think some of the responses have get the sense that you're more inclined towards, UNEP is more inclined towards regulating. The regulation can be on certain degrees, from very soft to going to complete ban or anything like this. So I think, and then of course there's an alternative argument which basically says that the technologies and the recycling and the waste management technologies have evolved to the level, or they can evolve to the level that without banning or without restricting the use of the plastic, they can be recycled and they can be reusable, and then without really adversely affecting the trade and the packaging and the other kind of comforts of life. I think this is the balance which this government which you have taken the task up. You have to basically balance it out in that way. And then I just want to reiterate that the peculiar interests of the developing countries, I think they need to be taken into consideration. Capacity building, financial gaps, they might be very redundant words, but in the developing world, they're still very much. Thank you very much.
Before I take the view of Dr. Ehtisham, the bureaucracy and executives, there is an online question, ma'am, and it is about the role of waste management companies and the street scavengers in terms of their recycling and reuse. And the question is there any such project in the region which UNEP is a part of?
And Ehtisham, you are the only representative of bureaucracy here. So what is it that the government is doing to reduce this plastic pollution?
I'm already a rare species here. Traveled all the way from 7 hours away. So
oh my goodness.
Yeah. Ma'am, you've been talking about taking different steps at organizational level by your organization at the collaboration of different countries and things like that. I just wanted to know if you've been attending to with equal vigor to the awareness part of it. I would supplement my question with research which was conducted by UNESCO recently, and a copy of which is with me right now, getting every school climate ready. 100 curriculums have been reviewed, 100 national curriculums have been reviewed as part of this study. And almost half of them have not even a single mention of climate change in their curriculums. And the rest of the countries had minimal inclusion in some of the subjects like geography, science, and biology. So I'm more concerned about creating awareness, since I come from an education department, in the next generation, preparing them to face the dilemma 15 years down the line.
No, thank you very, very much. I'll start with the comment on e-waste. Who made that comment? I'm sorry. Yes, exactly. No, thank you. And you were doing all that careful research on this. Look, e-waste is a scourge. And I can only agree with you that we are seeing that as an ever-growing flow to a number of location countries or recipient, quote unquote, unwillingly so. I mean, I can tell you horror stories, as I'm sure you can tell me, about secondhand vehicles, secondhand buses being exported, the windows painted white when they arrive. They are stuffed with e-waste. So the person who thought he was buying a secondhand bus, the company in that importing country, ends up with this stuff on their hands. And it happens out of ports in Europe, and I can tell you which. The point here is it is absolutely critical that port authorities go after these crooks and criminals, that these gangs that are often in the global north are closed down in the export country port, and that serious fines that they're taken to court. It is illegal under the Basel Treaty. It is illegal. Transboundary transportation of hazardous waste is a crime. One has to pay the fine and pay for the crime, but that will take both sides here. We've engaged with a number of exporting ports. They often say that they're not exporting ports till the point that you can prove that they are an exporting port. But the other dimension to the e-waste story is, of course, US mining. I mean, not necessarily, but let's recall that those rare material, cobalt, copper, etc., that we keep taking out of the belly of the earth are in our garbage heap. And it's only when the global economy understands that yesterday's garbage is tomorrow's future, but that's a little bit more, longer term. But that's the story that we have to consider. 65% of the global waste dump, globally speaking, is single-use plastic, 65%, not in Pakistan, because you have much more organic stream in the waste, but 65 globally. Sorry, what am I saying? 65% of all plastic waste is single-use. 35% is non-single-use, planes, trains, automobiles, appliances, and electrical, and that includes e-waste. That's your 35%. We need to build these 35%, so easy disassembly, easy, reuse, and again, thinking about how do we deal with that circularity. But it's a big issue, very big issue, and thank you for your work. It sounds very interesting. I'd like to know more about it. Bans and reflecting on the pandemic. I think you're absolutely right. All of a sudden, we didn't dare touch anything. The knife had to be, if you're eating out or you single-use plastic, all of that. It's a scourge. Thankfully, the pandemic is beginning to recede, but we saw a significant uptick in plastic use because the fear. Later on, we learned that actually it wasn't by touch, it was by inhalation. But by that time, the sort of global awareness, I have to do, it's all touch, it's all this. We sort of we thought that it would be safer for us if everything was wrapped in plastic. Thankfully, people are beginning to leave this behind. In restaurants, you get your knife and your fork, and they are not necessarily packed in plastic. In planes, trains, and so on. And in purchasing, you don't have to wrap everything. And we've learned that you can actually wash your produce when you come home, and you'll be just fine. But we did see a significant uptick. And of course, one dimension of waste that will be there will be medical waste, which has a significant plastic content, which will have to be part and parcel of the story for incineration, just for hazard and safety. Thank you to the gentleman who aligned himself fully with the lady. I aligned myself with both of you. And look, I mean, the justice component is very real, very, very real, and in so many levels. North, South, within a country, sort of wealth stratification, access stratification, and so on. We're not pushing a particular solution. I just mentioned regulations because when you see countries where you don't have plastic in the environment, it's often because it has value. I grew up in a place where every bottle, it was bottles in the time, right? And now it's plastic. You get 2 kroner back. So if you're a little girl and you see, it's like finding a candy bar. Because you've got to pick that up, take it straight to the supermarket. There's a little machine, and out comes 2 kroner, and you can go with your money and buy candy. So where you have a regulatory setting, it works. And obviously, in a poorer country with the complexity that all of that carries, it's a different way of making it work. We've seen that, for example, in Rwanda, where recycling, and Rwanda is not a sophisticated country, but they have just simply instituted this. You drive through Rwanda, you will not find one piece of plastic, not one candy wrapper, because it really worked both on the community awareness. There's a monthly cleaning day, and there's a value for the recycled waste that you will get back. But in larger jurisdictions, such as a big country like Pakistan, with a significant industrial base, it gets all the more complicated. And with a degree of devolution of municipal solid waste management, there are any number of complexities, and we get this. Restrictions will not be enough, bans are not enough, regulations are not enough, awareness is not enough. You need all of the above and then some. And then the rethinking of how the product is actually delivered, liquefied or not. On the question from online, no, UNEP is not right now, and that's not what we're doing. We are in the process of supporting a negotiations process. Others will be more suited to work with waste management companies. I will say that we are certainly looking at good examples of circularity in waste management. And we're trying to highlight and shine a light on that, particularly in developing countries. Chile, for example, has done an extraordinary job in that. And so we are shining a light on some of these waste management efforts simply because it's a middle income country like Pakistan and therefore offers some solutions. And to the gentleman from the government, thank you for coming from 7 hours. That's really, I feel very honored. Look, our friends in UNESCO, of course, have the mandate to work on education. And that study, which I was invited to be part of the release for, on climate education, was a very telling one, telling us that we actually are not helping kids to understand what climate change is. And we need to do much better. It's not a UNEP job, it is a UNESCO job. They have the mandate. But we from UNEP, as this convention nears reality, we need to ensure that our friends in the other UN agencies pick this up and fold it into their country programs where they're working on educational curricula. Some countries, it's happening voluntarily. In others, it's a heavier conversation. And I understand the difficulties around this, but certainly something very, very important.
I know time is short, but please give a...
I'm so sorry. But can I just say that I could have stayed on for another hour easy. And can I just say that for me to meet with specialists and scientists and economists and activists and engaged community, that's what will make the difference. And I ask that you continue to stay involved as this treaty moves forward. There's a lot of wealth in this room, I can see. So I hope that we'll be able to continue this dialogue. Thank you very much.
We have